We start our movie off with a narration by Peter Parker explaining that he's no ordinary teenager. We see several students on a bus, only to see that Peter is actually not on the bus. He's actually chasing the bus, and while it does stop, he has a little bit of bad luck with it. Nobody wants to sit with him, and he proceeds to go to school. Slowly, we're introduced to Peter's hierarchy in the school, as well as his relationship to his Aunt May and his Uncle Ben. Soon after, Peter's science class takes a field trip to a genetics laboratory at Columbia University. The lab works on spiders and has even managed to create new species of spiders through genetic manipulation and combination. Peter, meanwhile, is taking photographs of Mary Jane for the school newspaper, as well as for possible personal use as well. That means he's oblivious to a spider that lands on his hand and gives him a bad bite. Peter then goes home, feeling ill, and immediately goes to bed. We're then treated to a montage of what the venom is doing to Peter's genetic form, changing it and manipulating it into something completely new and amazing, spectacular even. We then flash over to one General Slocum, who visits Oscorp to see the results of their new super soldier formula that was produced by Norman Osborn. When one of Norman's top scientists, Dr. Straub, warns him the formula is unstable, General Slocum threatens to pull all of the military's funding from Oscorp. On top of that, Norman has also been threatened to have his company taken away from him, by both investors threatening to sell the company and his board as well. This causes Norman to expose himself to the formula, the first human test subject. It goes very well, gaining superhuman strength and agility. However, he's driven completely insane. He kills his scientists in a fit of rage and steals two other Oscorp inventions, an exoskeleton and a jet glider. We then flash over back to Peter, who wakes up the next morning feeling better than ever. He also has seen that his scrawny physique has been replaced with rippling muscle, and his eyesight is perfect, no longer requiring him to use glasses. We see the other powers he's developed, which includes enhanced agility, catching Mary Jane as she slips and catching all of her food on the tray with no issue, as well as being able to shoot webs from his wrists, which accidentally peeves off his bully Flash Thompson. Peter goes to his locker to try and figure out just what the heck is going on, with Flash in hot pursuit. As Flash nearly decks him across the back of the head, he's able to dodge just in time, as if sensing it somehow. This goes into a fight between him and Flash, which is extremely one-sided, as Flash isn't even able to get a hit on Peter, while Peter is dodging every one of his blows with ease. Peter finally sends Flash skidding across the floor, and he retreats because he really doesn't know what the heck just went on. Later that night, he and Mary Jane talk, trying to avoid the subject of what happened and casually flirting, which is then interrupted by Flash, who comes to pick her up in his car. Peter then comes to the conclusion that to get Mary Jane interested in him, he needs money for a car. However, he needs to find other avenues, as both Ben and May don't have any cash for him. He finds an ad in the newspaper. A local professional wrestling league will pay $3,000 to anyone who can survive for 3 minutes in the ring with their champion, Bonesaw. Peter designs a suit and heads out to the arena, telling Ben and May he's going to the library. Ben and May express their worry for Peter that he's been acting differently, and while Peter does try to set those away, Ben does insist on driving him to the library instead. While Peter does try to explain a bit of his powers, including the beating of Flash Thompson, Ben then interjects saying that he shouldn't give in to that sort of power for his personal use. He then says the iconic line that with great power comes great responsibility, and that responsibility is to know when and how to best use that power. Peter reacts badly and scolds Ben before storming out of the car. Peter then goes against Bonesaw, and not only does he survive the time limit, he also kind of embarrasses Bonesaw. After going to get his $3,000, it turns out he's only going to be getting about $100. This is due to some technicalities in the contract as well as the description. Peter storms out of the office, angry at being gypped, and after that an armed robber runs past him, with Peter not moving to do a thing. After Peter exits the building, he notices a crowd gathering. He makes his way through and notices a fatally wounded Ben. The robber not only shot him, but also stole his car. Peter makes it his mission to chase down the robber and eventually does find him when he's held up in a building by police. Peter beats him mercilessly and causes him to fall out of a window where he then falls to his death. That same night, we flash over to a weapons test at Quest Aerospace, the company that's considering buying Oscorp. They're testing a prototype weapon, however they're interrupted by the Green Goblin, who's wearing the Oscorp exoskeleton and riding the jet glider, who not only attacks the people, but also kills them all and destroys the prototype as well. We then move on back to Peter, who has been inspired by Ben's words and decides to use his spider powers for the greater good. He designs a brand new costume, fighting crime wherever he goes, whether it be robberies, muggings, etc., etc. He becomes known as the Amazing Spider-Man, a name that he borrowed from the announcer at the wrestling match. However, this does not endear him to everyone, as one J. Jonah Jameson, the owner of the Daily Bugle of New York City, writes hate and smear articles about him constantly, trying to demonize him in the eyes of the public and having a good amount of success in that. However, funnily enough, Peter does turn in photos of Spider-Man and gets paid by the man as well. We then go over some more details, with Mary Jane, Peter, and Norman Osborn, Peter's bestest friend in the entire world, graduate from high school and move to Manhattan, with Peter and Harry getting a loft together to attend classes at Empire State. Shortly after, Mary Jane and Harry do get together, with Harry apologizing but pointing out that Peter was always too shy and never took up the offer. We then flash on back over to Norman, who is actually very happy that Quest has to reorganize after the killing of Slocum. Oscorp gets even more government contracts and the company's stock is soaring. This is the part where he learns that his board of directors has chosen this moment to accept a buyout from Quest. His insanity manifests itself in a split personality, and we see that he's taking orders from that personality, known as the Green Goblin. We then flash over to Annual Unity Day, an Oscorp holiday thrown for the entire city of New York, with foods, parades, and balloons, and also ironically where the Green Goblin decides his first attack, where he kills the board of directors and endangers Mary Jane as well. Spider-Man then appears and fights off the Goblin and rescues Mary Jane when she nearly falls to her death. Peter and Mary Jane have a moment before he swings off, and later they do actually talk and she goes to walk away. However, she's pursued by some thugs who chase her into an alley. Peter goes in as well as Spider-Man and beats up the thugs, and earns him an upside-down kiss with Mary Jane. Flashing back over to the Goblin, who's licking his wounds from the previous fight, he decides that he and Spider-Man need to work together. He then attacks the Bugle office to lure Spider-Man into a trap, using knockout gas to subdue him. He then transports Spider-Man to the top of a building and offers him his partnership, allowing him to think it over rather than just kill him. He leaves Spider-Man, warning him that the city will turn on him eventually, no matter how much good he does. Soon after, the Green Goblin and Spider-Man meet up again in an apartment fire caused by the Goblin, where Peter turns down the offer from the Goblin and the two begin to fight, Peter getting cut by some spinning blades in the process. The two then go their separate ways, and actually do meet up coincidentally when Aunt May invites them both to their Thanksgiving dinner. He then figures out that Peter is Spider-Man when he observes the wounds on his arms that he had caused. He quickly leaves after insulting Mary Jane. However, later that night, the Goblin blows up Aunt May's wall and causes her to go to the hospital. Peter stays with May at the hospital, where he and Mary Jane have a little bit of a moment. Harry sees this and knows that his relationship with Mary Jane is over. The Goblin then strikes again, striking at Spider-Man through Mary Jane, kidnapping her, and sabotages a trolley car along the Roosevelt Bridge. When Peter does arrive, the Goblin gives him the choice of saving Mary Jane or the trolley car, not being able to save both. Causing both of them to drop from the bridge, Spider-Man does manage to save both with an assist from a passing barge and pedestrians on the bridge, who pelt the Goblin with debris and delay him from his attempt to kill Spider-Man. The Goblin then grabs Spider-Man and throws him into an abandoned building. The two begin their final fight, with the Goblin easily overpowering Spider-Man. He beats him brutally, as well as also throwing a pumpkin bomb directly in front of Peter, which not only badly wounds him but also rips up his costume, including his mask. The Goblin then pins Peter to a wall, pulling out two electrified blades and taunting Peter about how he's going to kill Mary Jane slowly, how he could have made it so much easier on himself. However, this gives Spider-Man the motivation to go all out, absolutely destroying the Goblin, hitting him with several tactile moves as well as just beating him through walls and even throwing a wall at him. The Goblin, in an effort to save himself, reveals that he's Norman. Peter is left shocked and unsure what to do, with Norman then beginning to ask for forgiveness. He starts going on a story about how he's like a father to Peter, how forgiveness is the greatest thing. And with this, we see him use the wrist control to manipulate the glider to go right behind Spider-Man. Peter refuses his forgiveness and says that Ben Parker was his father. With the Goblin persona taking over again, he then commands the jet glider to go forth, blades at the ready, to try and spear Spider-Man. Spider-Man, sensing the incoming danger, does a backflip over it. and the glider proceeds to stab Norman into the wall. Impaled, bleeding, and dying, Norman looks at Peter and tells him not to tell Harry before finally dying. Peter takes Norman's body back to his penthouse apartment, where Harry sees them and blames Spider-Man for Norman's death. Later, we have the funeral for his father, and he vows revenge and thanks Peter for being such a good friend. Peter goes to visit Uncle Ben's grave, where Mary Jane finds him and confesses her love for him. They kiss passionately, and Peter wants to tell her the truth, but simply can't. He tells her then that they can never be more than just friends, as he's afraid that his life would cause her danger. Peter then leaves a saddened Mary Jane, walking away, knowing that both his blessing and his curse in life is being Spider-Man.